The dust kicked up by Jake Sullivan's horse settled slowly in the morning heat as he rode into the small town of Cedar Creek. His leather chaps were worn thin from years on the trail, and his hat had seen better days, but his eyes were sharp and alert. He had been riding for 3 days straight, following rumors of work at the Double R Ranch. Jake was a man without roots. His parents had died when he was 12, leaving him to fend for himself in a world that didn't care much for orphaned boys. He had learned to ride rope and shoot out of necessity, becoming a skilled cowhand who moved from ranch to ranch, never staying long enough to call any place home. As he guided his mare down the dusty main street, Jake noticed the town seemed quieter than most. Shopkeepers watched him from their doorways with cautious eyes. A few women gathered their children closer as he passed. Something wasn't right here. But Jake had learned not to ask too many questions too quickly. The saloon doors swung open as he approached, and out stepped a tall man with silver hair and a star pinned to his vest. Sheriff Tom Bradley had the weathered look of someone who had seen too much trouble in his lifetime. His hand rested casually on his gun belt as he studied the newcomer. "You heading through? Or staying?" the sheriff asked, his voice neither friendly nor hostile. "Looking for work?" Jake replied, touching the brim of his hat respectfully. "Heard the Double R might be hiring?" Sheriff Bradley's expression softened slightly. "Ranch is about 5 miles north of here. But I'll tell you straight, there's been trouble. Might want to think twice before signing on." Jake had heard similar warnings before. Trouble seemed to follow him, or maybe he followed it. Either way, he needed the work. What kind of trouble? Before the sheriff could answer, a commotion erupted from the general store. A woman's voice rose in anger, followed by the sound of something crashing to the ground. Both men turned to see a young woman with fiery red hair backing out of the store, her face flushed with anger. "Ow. You can tell Marcus Kane that I won't be intimidated," she shouted at someone inside. "This land has been in my family for 3 generations, and I won't give it up without a fight." The woman turned and nearly collided with Jake's horse. She looked up at him with green eyes that sparkled with determination and unshed tears. For a moment, neither spoke. Jake had never seen anyone so beautiful, but more than that, he recognized something in her expression, the same stubborn refusal to back down that he saw in his own mirror every morning. "Excuse me," she said, her voice quieter now, but still carrying steel underneath. She walked quickly toward a small wagon hitched nearby. Sheriff Bradley sighed heavily. "That's Emma Patterson. Owns a small spread about 10 miles east. She's the trouble I was talking about." "She doesn't look like trouble to me," Jake said, still watching as Emma climbed onto her wagon seat. "Not her causing it, son. She's caught in the middle of it. Marcus Kane wants her land, and he's not the type to take no for an answer. He owns the Double R now. Bought it last month. Been pushing out all the small ranchers, one way or another." God, Jake's jaw tightened. He had met men like Kane before. Wealthy bullies who thought money gave them the right to take whatever they wanted. What's so special about her land? River runs right through it. The Clearwater River. Best water source for miles around. Control that, and you control everything else in this valley. As if sensing their conversation about her, Emma looked back at them. Her eyes met Jake's again, and this time he saw something that made his chest tighten. Fear. She was trying to hide it, but he had worn that same mask too many times not to recognize it. Emma's wagon rolled away, leaving a small cloud of dust in its wake. Jake watched until she disappeared around a bend in the road, then turned back too. "The sheriff? This Kane fellow? He hiring?" Sheriff Bradley studied him carefully. "You don't strike me as the type to work for a man like that." "You're right, but I need to see what I'm dealing with before I decide which side I'm on." The sheriff nodded slowly. "Might be wise. Watch yourself, son. Kane's got some rough men working for him. They're not above using their guns to solve problems." Jake had been in more gunfights than he cared to remember. Each one had left its mark, not just on his body, but on his soul. Was tired of violence, tired of always being ready to run or fight, but something about Emma Patterson's defiant stand in front of that store stirred something inside him that had been sleeping for a long time. "I'll keep that in mind," he said, nudging his horse forward. "Thanks for the warning, Sheriff." As Jake rode north toward the Double R Ranch, he couldn't shake the image of Emma's face from his mind. He had spent years avoiding connections, avoiding the kind of complications that came from caring too much about other people's problems. It was safer that way, easier to keep moving when the time came. But as he topped a hill and saw the clear river winding through the valley below, its water catching the sunlight like scattered diamonds, Jake felt something he hadn't experienced in years, the desire to stay and fight for something worthwhile. The river was beautiful, peaceful. He could understand why someone would fight to protect it. He knew that taking a job with Kane would put him on the wrong side of this conflict. But sometimes the best way to help someone was to know your enemy from the inside. Jake had learned that lesson the hard way years ago, when he couldn't save the people who mattered most to him this time, he told himself as he rode toward whatever waited ahead. This time might be different. The Double R Ranch sprawled across the valley like a small kingdom. Jake had seen plenty of large spreads in his time, but this one was different. Everything was too perfect, too organized, as if someone had built it to make a statement rather than just raise cattle. The main house stood 3 stories tall, with white columns and a wraparound porch that belonged more in the city than on a working ranch. As Jake rode up to the main corral, several cowboys stopped their work to study him. These weren't the usual ranch hands he was used to working alongside. These men wore their guns low on their hips and had the cold eyes of hired killers rather than cattlemen. Jake kept his expression neutral. Every instinct told him to be ready for trouble. A man emerged from the largest barn, and Jake knew immediately this had to be Marcus Kane. He was tall and broad-shouldered, wearing expensive clothes that probably cost more than most cowboys made in a year. His dark hair was slicked back, and a thin mustache sat above lips that seemed permanently curved in a sneer. When he smiled, it didn't reach his eyes. "You must be the drifter looking for work," Kane said, his voice smooth as silk, but with an undertone that reminded Jake of a rattlesnake's warning. "Sheriff Bradley sent word you were coming." "I'm Marcus Kane, owner of this spread." Jake dismounted and extended his hand. Kane's grip was firm, but held just a moment too long, like a man testing another man's strength and will. "Jake Sullivan. It heard you might need experienced hands." Kane walked around Jake's horse, examining both rider and mount with the calculating. "I have someone who saw everything in terms of what it could do for him. You come with references? My work speaks for itself. Been handling cattle since I was old enough to sit a horse." "Guns?" Kane asked casually, but Jake caught the sharp interest in his eyes. "Can you handle those as well as cattle?" Jake had hoped to avoid this question, but he should have known better. Men like Kane didn't hire cowboys. They hired muscle with enough cattle knowledge to provide cover for their real business. "When necessary," Jake answered truthfully. "But I prefer to solve problems without shooting." Kane laughed, a sound with no humor in it. "A peaceful man. I like that. Sometimes peace requires a strong hand to maintain it, don't you think?" Before Jake could answer, one of Kane's men approached. He was a lean, dangerous-looking character, with dead eyes and scars on his knuckles that spoke of too many fights. His name was Slade, and Jake could tell from the way the other men gave him space that he was Kane's enforcer. "Doss, we got that Patterson woman's cattle wandering onto our land again," Slade said, his voice like gravel. "Wait. Boys and drive them back, permanently?" Jake tensed at the mention of Emma's name, but kept his face blank. Kane noticed the reaction anyway. The man didn't miss much. "Patience, Slade. We'll handle Miss Patterson in due time. For now, just drive the cattle back to her side of the fence. No need for violence, yet." Slade looked disappointed, but nodded. As he walked away, Kane turned back to Jake with that cold smile. "The Patterson place borders our eastern range. The woman who owns it has been having trouble keeping her livestock where they belong. We've been more than generous about the situation, but patience has limits." Jake knew a lie when he heard one. He had seen plenty of range disputes in his time, and they usually started with someone moving fence lines or cutting wire to make it look like cattle were straying. But he just nodded and kept his thoughts to himself. "I'll put you to work with the regular crew for now," Kane continued. $30 a month, plus room and board. But there might be opportunities for extra pay if you prove reliable. It was good money, too good for regular cowhand work. Jake knew what that meant. Extra pay would come from jobs that had nothing to do with cattle and everything to do with intimidation or worse. Fair enough, Jake said. When do I start? Right now. Oh. Miguel will show you where to bunk and get you settled. Cain gestured to an older Mexican man who had been quietly watching from nearby. Unlike the gunman, Miguel had kind eyes and the calloused hands of someone who actually worked with cattle. As Cain walked away, Miguel approached with a cautious smile. Welcome to the Double R, he said quietly. Hope you know what you're getting yourself into, amigo. Still figuring that out, Jake admitted. How long have you been here? I worked for the original owner, Robert Russell, for 15 years. Good man, fair boss. When he died last year, his widow had to sell. She couldn't handle a spread this size alone. Miguel's expression darkened. Things have changed since Mr. Cain took over. That evening, Jake sat with the other cowboys around a campfire outside the bunkhouse. Most of Cain's regular hands were, like Miguel, honest men who needed work and didn't ask too many questions about their boss's business dealings. But scattered among them were Slade's men. The gunfighters who made everyone else nervous. As the fire died down, Jake lay on his narrow bunk and stared at the ceiling. Through the window, he could see stars reflected in the Clearwater River, somewhere to the east. Beyond his sight, Emma Patterson was probably lying awake too, worrying about her future and wondering how long she could hold out against Cain's pressure. Jake had told himself he was taking this job to understand the enemy. But he was beginning to realize he had another motive. For the first time in years, he had found something worth protecting. The question was whether he could do it without becoming the very thing he had spent his life trying to avoid. Tomorrow, Cain would probably send him on his first real test, something that would show whether Jake was willing to cross lines that couldn't be uncrossed. Jake closed his eyes and tried to prepare himself for whatever moral compromise lay ahead, knowing that Emma's life might depend on how well he could play the part of a man without conscience. 3 days into his employment at the Double R, Jake got his first real assignment. Cain called him into the big house early in the morning, leading him to a study lined with expensive books that looked like they had never been opened. Maps of the surrounding area covered one wall, with red pins marking various properties. Jake noticed that Emma's land was marked with several pins and had thick red lines drawn across it. I have a job for you, Sullivan, Cain said, pouring himself a whiskey despite the early hour. I consider it a test of your loyalty and discretion. Jake waited, keeping his expression neutral while his gut tightened with anticipation. Miss Patterson has been warned about her cattle straying onto my land. Yesterday, we found 50 head grazing in my best pasture. I want you to take Slade and to other men, round up those cattle, and drive them back where they belong. It sounded simple enough, but Jake had learned to listen for what wasn't being said. All of them. Cain's smile was sharp as a blade. Every last one, and Sullivan. Accidents happen when moving large herds. Cattle sometimes get spooked, run in the wrong direction, fall into ravines. Such a shame when that happens. There it was, the real test. Cain wanted Jake to help steal or destroy Emma's livestock, making it look accidental. It was an old trick used by land grabbers to pressure small ranchers into selling. Without cattle, Emma couldn't make a living, and she would have no choice but to give up her land. I understand, Jake said, his voice steady, despite the anger building in his chest. An hour later, Jake rode east with Slade and 2 other gunmen named Briggs and Carson. They were rough men who spoke casually about violence, as if discussing the weather. Jake listened to their conversation and learned more than he wanted to know about Cain's methods of persuasion. Last week we spooked Johnson's horses so bad they ran through 3 fences, Briggs was saying with a laugh. Old man sold out 2 days later rather than face the repair costs. Patterson's tougher than Johnson, Carson added. Might take more than scattered cattle to convince her. Slade's voice was cold as winter wind. Boss has plans for her. This is just the beginning. They found Emma's cattle grazing peacefully near the river on what was clearly her land, not Cain's. The fence line was obvious, and several of the posts still showed fresh cuts where someone had deliberately damaged them. Jake realized Cain's men had cut the wire to let the cattle wander, then planned to blame Emma for not maintaining her boundaries. There they are, Slade said with satisfaction. Trespassing on Mr. Kane's property. Jake bit his tongue to keep from pointing out the obvious lie. Instead, he watched as the other men began driving the cattle away from the river toward rougher ground. This wasn't the way back to Emma's ranch. They were heading toward a steep ravine where frightened cattle could easily fall and be injured or killed. As they pushed the herd faster than was safe, Jake saw his chance. He spurred his horse ahead of the others and began turning the cattle away from the ravine, using his skills to guide them toward safer ground. "What are you doing?" Slade shouted, riding up beside him. "Keeping them together?" Jake called back. "If we lose half the herd in that ravine, Kane will have our heads. He wants them back on Patterson land, not dead at the bottom of a cliff." It was a reasonable excuse, and Slade couldn't argue with it without admitting they had planned to harm the cattle. Frustrated but unable to object, he followed Jake's lead as they drove the herd toward Emma's ranch house. As they approached the small homestead, Jake got his first good look at Emma's operation. It was modest, but well-maintained, with sturdy corrals and a small barn that had been built with care and attention to detail. The house was simple, but had flower boxes under the windows that showed a woman's touch. It was the kind of place that felt like a home rather than just a business. Emma emerged from the house as they approached, her red hair catching the sunlight. She wore practical work clothes and carried a rifle, though she kept it lowered. Could see the tension in her shoulders and the way her eyes darted between the four men. "Miss Patterson," Slade called out in a mocking tone, "we found your cattle wandering onto Mr. Kane's land again. Seems like you're having trouble keeping track of your livestock." Emma's green eyes flashed with anger. "That's impossible. I checked that fence line yesterday morning. The cattle were all on my side." "Well, they weren't there an hour ago," Briggs said with a sneer. "Maybe you should invest in better fencing instead of letting your problems become Mr. Kane's problems." Jake watched Emma's face as she processed what was happening. She was smart enough to know this was harassment, but also practical enough to know that four armed men weren't people to argue with, especially when she was alone. "Thank you for bringing them back," she said carefully, her voice controlled despite the anger Jake could see simmering underneath. "I'll make sure to check the fence line more carefully." As the other men began driving the cattle into Emma's corral, Jake lingered behind. When Emma looked at him, he touched his hat brim respectfully. "Ma'am, you might want to check your eastern fence line," he said quietly, his voice too low for the others to hear. "Sometimes wire gets cut by ... weather damage. Might want to repair." "It's soon." Emma's eyes widened slightly as she understood his meaning. For a moment, gratitude flickered across her face, but she was smart enough not to say anything that might be overheard. "I'll do that," she said simply, as they rode back toward the Double R. Slade was unusually quiet. Jake could feel the man's suspicious gaze on him, but kept his expression neutral. He had managed to save Emma's cattle this time, but he knew it was only a temporary victory. Kane would escalate his harassment, and next time, Jake might not be in a position to help. That evening, Jake volunteered for night guard duty, something that surprised the other cowboys. But he had his reasons. Once everyone was asleep, he saddled his horse quietly and rode toward Emma's ranch. He needed to warn her about what was coming, even if it meant revealing his true allegiances. As he approached her house, he saw a light still burning in the window. Emma was awake, probably worrying about the future and wondering how long she could hold out against Kane's pressure. Jake dismounted near the porch and called out softly, "Miss Patterson?" "It's Jake Sullivan. I need to talk to you." The light went out immediately, and Jake heard the sound of a rifle being cocked. Smart woman, she wasn't taking any chances. "What do you want?" Her voice came from inside the darkened house. "To help you," Jake said simply. "But I need you to trust me." Emma opened her door cautiously, the rifle still in her hands but no longer pointing directly at Jake. In the moonlight, he could see the exhaustion in her face and the way her shoulders sagged with the weight of fighting a battle she couldn't win alone. "You work for Kane," she said, her voice filled with suspicion and disappointment. "Why would you want to help me?" Jake removed his hat and held it in his hands, a gesture of respect his mother had taught him years ago. "Because what he's doing isn't right, and because... He paused, searching for the right words. Because I've spent too many years running away from fights that mattered. Emma studied his face in the pale light, looking for signs of deception. Jake stood perfectly still, letting her take all the time she needed to decide whether to trust him. Finally, she stepped back and gestured for him to come inside. Her home was small, but comfortable, with handmade furniture that spoke of care and craftsmanship. Family photographs lined the mantelpiece, showing 3 generations of Pattersons, who had called this land home. Jake could see why Emma was fighting so hard to keep it. Your fence was cut deliberately, Jake said without preamble. Kane's men did it to make it look like your cattle were straying. Today's harassment was just the beginning. Emma's hand tightened. On her rifle, I suspected as much. But knowing it and proving it are 2 different things. It gets worse. Kane has maps of the entire valley in his study. Your property is marked with red pins and lines. He's planning something big, and he needs your land to make it work. The river, Emma said quietly. It's always been about the river? Jake nodded. Control the water, control everything else. But Emma hesitated, then decided she deserved to hear the whole truth. He's not going to stop with cattle raids and cut fences. Men like Kane escalate until they get what they want. Emma moved to the window and looked out toward the river that ran through her land. My grandfather built this place with his bare hands. My father expanded it, and my mother kept it running after he died. 3 generations of Patterson's sweat and blood are in this soil. She turned back to Jake, her green eyes blazing with determination. I won't give it up without a fight. You can't fight Kane alone, Jake said gently. He has too many men too. Much money, and Sheriff Bradley can't protect you if Kane decides to use force. Then what do you suggest? Emma's voice carried a note of desperation she was trying to hide. Jake had been thinking about that very question during the long ride. From town, we need evidence of what he's doing, something that would force the territorial authorities to step in. And we need allies, other ranchers who are facing the same pressure. Most of them have already sold out or been run off. The few who remain are too scared to stand up to Kane. What about your neighbors to the south, the Morales family? Emma's expression softened. Miguel and Rosa have been good friends to me, but they're just getting by themselves. Miguel works for Kane now. He needs the money. Jake smiled. Miguel's the one who showed me around my first day. He's a good man, Emma. I think he'd help if he knew there was a real chance of stopping Kane. They spent the next hour planning quietly, their heads bent over rough maps Emma drew of the surrounding ranches. Jake found himself noticing the way Emma's hair caught the lamplight and the determined set of her jaw when she was thinking. She was more beautiful than any woman he had ever known, but it was her courage that truly took his breath away. As dawn approached, Jake knew he had to return to the Double R before his absence was noticed. I need to go, he said reluctantly. But I'll try to get word to you about Kane's next move. Emma walked him to the door. Jake, she said softly, why are you doing this? Could just ride away. Keep moving like you did before. Jake looked down at his hat, trying to find words for feelings he didn't fully understand himself. I've been running from something my whole life. Maybe it's time I ran toward something instead. Emma reached out and briefly touched his hand. Be careful. If Kane suspects you're helping me, he won't find out, Jake promised, though they both knew how dangerous his double life had become. The ride back to the Double R seemed longer than usual. Jake's mind was full of Emma, her courage, her determination, the way she had trusted him despite every reason not to. For the first time in years, he felt like he was part of something larger than himself. But his warm feelings evaporated when he reached the ranch and saw Kane waiting for him outside the bunkhouse. The man's expression was cold and calculating, and Jake realized his absence might not have gone unnoticed after all. Early morning ride, Sullivan, Kane asked casually, but his eyes were hard as flint. Couldn't sleep, Jake replied, hoping his voice sounded steady. Sometimes a ride helps clear my head. Kane studied him for a long moment. I appreciate initiative in my men, but I also value loyalty. I trust you understand the difference. Yes, sir, I do. Good, because I have another job for you today. The Patterson woman needs to understand that her stubbornness has consequences. I want you to take some men and pay her another visit. This time, Make sure she gets the message. Jake's stomach dropped, but he kept his expression neutral. What kind of message? Kane's smile was like a wolf showing its teeth, the kind that explains how dangerous it can be for a woman living alone in such an isolated area. Accidents happen to people who don't have proper protection. It was a direct threat, barely disguised. Kane was escalating just as Jake had predicted, and Emma was running out of time. Jake nodded as if he understood and approved, while his mind raced to figure out how to warn Emma and protect her without revealing his own position. I understand, Jake said. When do you want this done? Today. Take Slade and 3 others. Make it clear that my patience is wearing thin. As Kane walked away, Jake felt the weight of impossible choices settling on his shoulders. He was one man trying to stand between Emma and Kane's ruthless ambition, and time was running out for both of them. But he had made his choice the night. He first saw her standing up to Kane's intimidation. He had to find a way to keep them both alive long enough to expose Kane's crimes and bring him to justice. Jake knew he had to act fast. Kane's threat against Emma was escalating beyond intimidation into real danger. As he prepared his horse for the ride to Emma's ranch, he caught Miguel's eye and gave him a subtle signal they had arranged the night before. Miguel understood immediately and began creating a distraction by loudly arguing with another worker about missing tools. While everyone was focused on the commotion, Jake slipped away and rode hard toward the morale spread, which lay between the Double R and Emma's ranch. He found Miguel's wife, Rosa, hanging laundry behind their small adobe house. Senora Morales, Jake said urgently, I need you to get word to Emma Patterson immediately. Tell her to take her rifle and hide by the river bend near the old cottonwood grove. Tell her, Jake said, to stay there until sunset, no matter what she hears. Rosa's dark eyes filled with worry. What is happening? Kane's men are coming to hurt her. She needs to disappear for a few hours. Jake pressed a silver dollar into Rosa's weathered hand. Please, her life depends on it. Rosa nodded solemnly and immediately began unhitching one of their horses. Jake rode back toward the Double R, his mind racing as he tried to figure out how to handle the next few hours. When he rejoined Slade and the others, he was only minutes behind schedule. Slade gave him a suspicious look but said nothing as they mounted up and headed toward Emma's ranch. Kane wants this handled right, Slade said as they rode. The woman needs to understand that accidents happen to people who don't cooperate. Maybe a fire in her barn, or her well gets poisoned. Things that make living alone seem too dangerous. Jake's hands tightened on his reins, but he forced himself to nod. Whatever it takes. When they reached Emma's ranch, the house appeared empty. Jake felt a wave of relief, hoping Rosa had delivered his message in time. They searched the house and barn, finding no sign of Emma. Where is she? Briggs growled, kicking over a wooden bucket in frustration. Maybe she's checking her cattle, Jake suggested. Or visiting neighbors. Slade's eyes narrowed. Or maybe someone warned her we were coming. The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel. Jake met Slade's stare steadily, knowing that any sign of guilt or nervousness would confirm the man's suspicions. You think she has spies in Kane's organization? Jake asked. That would be interesting information for the boss. It was a calculated risk, turning Slade's suspicion outward rather than inward. Slade considered this, then nodded slowly. Maybe we should search the area, see if she's hiding nearby. They spent 2 hours combing the ranch and surrounding areas, but Emma had vanished completely. Jake suggested they check near the river, leading them away from the cottonwood grove, where he hoped Emma was hidden. By late afternoon, Slade was growing frustrated and suspicious again. Slade muttered. Nobody disappears this completely unless they know trouble is coming. As they prepared to head back to the Double R, Jake noticed smoke rising from the direction of town. A lot of smoke, black and thick against the afternoon sky. Something was burning, something big. What's that? Carson pointed toward the smoke. They rode to a hill that gave them a better view and saw that it was the Double R itself that was burning. It's not the main house, but the largest barn and several outbuildings. Even from a distance, they could see people running around like ants, trying to fight the fire. The boss is going to have our heads, Briggs said, spurring his horse toward home. They raced back to find chaos. The fire had started in the hay barn and spread quickly. Cain was shouting orders, his face black with soot and twisted with rage. When he saw Jake and the others riding up, his expression became murderous. "Where have you been?" Cain roared. "Half my ranch is burning and my men are off playing games." "You sent us to Patterson's place," Slade reminded him. "We were following your orders." Cain's eyes glittered with cold fury. "Did you deliver my message?" "She wasn't there," Slade admitted. The place was empty. Cain's face went white with anger. Empty? How convenient. His gaze swept over the four men, and Jake felt those cold eyes linger on him. Very convenient indeed. As they worked through the evening to contain the fire, Jake learned what had happened. A drifter passing through town had warned Sheriff Bradley that he had seen smoke and flames at the Double R by the time help arrived. 3 buildings were fully engulfed. The fire had started in multiple places simultaneously, suggesting arson. Jake couldn't prove it, but he suspected Emma hadn't spent the afternoon hiding by the river. She had struck back, hitting Cain where it hurt most, his property and his pride. It was a dangerous move, but it bought her time and showed Cain that she wasn't helpless. Late that night, as the last of the fires were extinguished, Cain called Jake into his study. The room reeked of smoke, and Cain's expensive clothes were ruined. His fury had settled into something cold and calculating, which was far more dangerous. "Someone is playing games with me," Cain said quietly. "Someone set those fires while my men were conveniently away from the ranch. Someone who knew exactly when we would be gone and where we would be." Jake kept his expression neutral. "You think it was Emma Patterson?" "I think Emma Patterson had help. I think someone in my organization is feeding her information." Cain's voice was deadly calm. "I'm going to find out who." Cain walked to his desk and pulled out a leather folder. Inside were documents that made Jake's blood run cold, detailed reports on every man working for the Double R, including background information that Cain should not have been able to obtain. "I make it my business to know everything about the men I employ," Cain continued. "For instance, I know that you, Jake Sullivan, have quite an interesting past. Orphaned at 12, raised yourself on various ranches across 3 territories. Quite good with a gun when pressed, but you seem to avoid violence when possible." Cain flipped through more papers. "What's particularly interesting is a report from a sheriff in Colorado. Seems you once helped a small rancher stand up to a land grabber. The rancher won, and the land grabber ended up in prison for murder and arson." Jake's heart stopped. If Cain knew about Colorado, he might already know about Jake's midnight visit to Emma's ranch. "That was a long time ago," Jake said carefully. "Was it?" Cain smiled his cold smile. "Because it seems like history might be repeating itself right here in my own valley. The question is, are you the same Jake Sullivan who played hero in Colorado? Or are you a man who's learned from his mistakes?" Cain closed the folder and looked directly into Jake's eyes. "I'm going to give you a chance to prove your loyalty, Sullivan. Tomorrow, you're going to take 3 men and burn Emma Patterson out. Her house, her barn, everything. If she tries to stop you, you're going to stop her permanently." The room fell silent except for the tick of Cain's expensive clock. Jake realized he had reached the moment he had been dreading, the point where he could no longer walk the line between protecting Emma and maintaining his cover. "And if I refuse?" Jake asked quietly. Cain's smile widened. "Then I'll know you're the same bleeding heart from Colorado, and you'll join Miss Patterson in a very permanent solution to my problems." Jake nodded slowly, buying time to think. "Understand good? Be ready at dawn." Cain's voice carried final authority. "This time there won't be any convenient disappearances or mysterious fires to save her." Dawn came too quickly, painting the sky the color of blood over the burnt remains of Cain's buildings. Spending most of the night quietly preparing for what he knew would be his final day at the Double R, he had cleaned his weapons, written a letter to Sheriff Bradley explaining Cain's crimes, and made peace with the possibility that he might not see another sunset. Cain was waiting for him at the corral, along with Slade and 2 other gunmen. The ranch owner looked like he hadn't slept either, his expensive clothes wrinkled and his eyes red with exhaustion and rage. The previous day's fire had cost him thousands of dollars and, more importantly, had made him look weak in front of his men. "Ready to prove yourself, Sullivan?" Cain asked, his voice carrying a dangerous edge. Jake nodded, swinging into his saddle. Let's get this done.
Ah.
As they rode toward Emma's ranch, Jake's mind was racing. He had sent Miguel ahead hours ago with instructions to gather their allies and position them around Devil's Canyon. If everything went according to plan, Emma would be safely hidden in the line shack, and Jake would lead Kane's men into an ambush. It was risky, but it was the only chance they had. When they reached Emma's property, Jake wasn't surprised too. Find it apparently deserted again. Kane's face darkened with fury as they searched the empty house and barn. "She's not here," Slade reported after checking the outbuildings. "Then we burn it anyway," Kane snarled. "She'll come running when she sees the smoke and we'll be waiting." Jake's heart sank. He had hoped to draw Kane away from Emma's home, not destroy it. But as Slade began splashing coal oil around the barn, Jake saw his chance. Emma's rifle was leaning against the barn wall where she had left it, and he had a clear view of the surrounding hills. "Wait," Jake said loudly.
Ow.
"Those rocks. She might be watching us." It was a lie, but it worked. Kane and his men turned to look where Jake was pointing, momentarily distracted. In that instant, Jake drew his weapon and pressed it against Kane's spine. "Nobody move," Jake said quietly. "This ends here." Kane went rigid with shock and rage. "You fool. You're outnumbered 3-1. "Maybe," Jake admitted. "But you'll be dead before your men can clear leather." Slade's hand moved toward his gun, but stopped when Jake pressed the barrel harder against Kane's back. "I wouldn't try it, Slade. Your boss isn't paying you enough to die for him." For a moment, the tableau held. 4 men frozen in deadly tension beside Emma's barn. Then the sound of horses approaching broke the silence. Miguel appeared first, followed by 6 other cowboys from the Double R, all armed and grim-faced. "Looks like the odds just changed," Miguel said calmly. His rifle trained on Slade. Kane's face went white as he realized how completely he had been outmaneuvered. His own men were turning against him, and he was helpless to stop it. "You have no idea who you're dealing with," Kane said through gritted teeth. "I have connections, political influence." "You can't what?" A new voice interrupted. Sheriff Bradley rode into the clearing, followed by 2 deputies. "Can't arrest a man for arson, intimidation, and conspiracy to commit murder?" Jake felt a wave of relief. Miguel had followed his instructions perfectly, delivering Jake's letter. To the sheriff, along with testimony from the other ranch hands about Kane's criminal activities, Sheriff Kane said, his voice regaining some of its usual smoothness, "I hope you're not taking the word of disgruntled employees over that of a respected businessman." Bradley smiled grimly. "Might be if that was all I had." But Emma Patterson made it into town this morning with some very interesting evidence. Emma emerged from behind a boulder where she had been watching the confrontation unfold. In her hands was a leather satchel that Jake recognized from Kane's study. "I borrowed these from Mr. Kane's office last night," Emma said, her voice steady. Despite the danger surrounding them, maps showing his plan to control the entire valley, correspondence with corrupt officials, and financial records proving he's been bribing government inspectors. Kane's composure finally cracked. "You little thief! You have no right to defend my home." Emma's eyes blazed with righteous anger. "To protect my neighbors from a man who murders and steals to get what he wants, I think I have every right." Sheriff Bradley took the satchel and quickly examined its contents. His expression grew darker with each document he read. "Marcus Kane, you're under arrest for conspiracy, bribery, intimidation, and arson. You have the right to." Kane suddenly twisted away from Jake and lunged for Slade's weapon. In the confusion that followed, guns were drawn and harsh words were exchanged, but no shots were fired. Jake tackled Kane to the ground while the sheriff's deputies secured Slade and the other gunmen as the dust settled. Jake found himself sitting beside Emma on her porch steps, watching as Kane and his men were loaded into the sheriff's wagon. The immediate danger was over, but Jake knew their problems were far from solved. "What happens now?" Emma asked quietly. "Kane will probably go to prison, but his political connections might help him escape justice," Jake admitted. "And even if he's convicted, there will be others like him. Men who see this valley and want to take it." Emma was quiet for a long moment, watching the river flow past her property. My grandfather used to say that water always finds a way. It goes around obstacles, wears down barriers, and keeps flowing no matter what tries to stop it. Jake looked at her, seeing the strength that had attracted him from the very beginning. You're not giving up? Never? Emma's voice was firm with resolve. This is my home, my family's legacy. I'll keep fighting for it as long as I have breath in my body. You won't have to fight alone, Jake said. If you'll have me, I'd like to stay, help you rebuild, protect what you've saved. Emma turned to look at him, her green eyes searching his face. You're tired of running? More tired of running away than running toward something, Jake replied. I've spent years looking for a place to belong. Maybe I found it. Emma smiled, the first genuine smile Jake had seen from her since the day they met. The work is hard. The pay is terrible, and there's always the chance that more men like Cain will come looking for trouble. Sounds perfect, Jake said, meaning every word, as the sun set over the valley. Painting the sky in shades of gold and purple, Jake and Emma sat together on the porch of the house that would soon be his home too. The Clearwater River continued, its eternal flow, carrying away the troubles of the day and reflecting the stars that were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. Miguel and Rosa had decided to stay as well, along with several of the other cowboys who had stood up to Cain. They would build something together, not just a ranch, but a community of people who understood that some things were worth fighting for. Jake had finally stopped running. It's not because he had found a place that was safe, but because he had found people worth facing danger alongside. The river would always flow between them and whatever troubles lay ahead. But it would also connect them to something larger than themselves, the endless cycle of seasons. The promise of new growth after every harsh winter, and the knowledge that home wasn't a place you found, but something you built with the people you chose to love. In the distance, a coyote howled at the rising moon, and Emma's hand found Jake's in the darkness. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight, they were together, and that was enough.